All right, everybody, welcome to the Weekend Interview Show. Unfortunately, I could not get a hold of Charles Key, which is a shame. But another acquaintance that I've made from the Oklahoma City Bombing Investigation Committee is Chris Emery. And I did interview him a couple of weeks ago, but I figure this is such a timely matter since Nichols is on trial again on state charges that it would be good to let the people have an opportunity to hear a different version than the McVeigh and Nichols boys did it. So, welcome back to the show, Chris.
Thank you, Phil. Thanks for having me.
Sure. Now, I read yesterday that they're expecting the Nichols trial to last from 4 to 6 months. That's surprising.
That is correct, if we get enough jurors to stay on the jury that long.
Oh, we've had some problems with that, have we?
Yes, they had to dismiss 2 jurors and an alternate because they found out that the 2 of the jurors were actually cousins of I believe a county prosecutor in Pittsburgh County who had nothing to do with the trial itself, but there was some impropriety exposed because evidently this district attorney was good friends with the current district attorney that's on the case, Wes Lane from Oklahoma County. So there's some vested interest to keep some separation there. And Stephen Taylor, the judge, was rightfully so in making the decision to dismiss those jurors and the alternate.
Yeah, and from what I read, he was pretty upset.
He was very upset, and that's a good sign to show that Judge Taylor, who's a U.S. or a state district judge, he's trying to keep some fairness in all of this, and he threatened to, on more than one occasion, to dismiss all charges against Nichols on, I believe, on administrative cause by prejudice is the legal term, which would be unfortunate because that would certainly waste all of the money that's been involved in getting this trial to the point where it is.
Well, and I was just thinking that would be very convenient probably for the prosecution to just go ahead and accidentally have it thrown out because when you and I talked a couple of weeks ago, you said that the lawyers for the defense this time, it's not going to be a Michael Tiger defense. They have a real defense this time. Maybe the prosecution would prefer that the charges get tossed out.
There's all kind of ways you can look at it, but you are correct in that respect. The prosecution on the state really doesn't have anything to stand on, and we had discussed this on a previous show. But unfortunately, the federal prosecution has a vested interest in this too, because information that was withheld by Judge Mache and withheld deliberately by the prosecution itself in the Nichols trial in Denver will certainly come of light and see the light of day in this particular trial. So whether it's dismissed on prejudice or just by a deliberate screw up as far as the prosecution, we certainly don't want that to happen as far as getting the truth out, at least from the victims and the survivors' standpoint.
Well, and as you said a couple of weeks ago, that the defense, their job is to defend him. So that doesn't necessarily mean getting to the truth. That just means creating as best reasonable doubt as they can. So we can't really look to them to really bring out everything that we've found out so far.
That's correct to a certain extent. You're right. But in the process of doing that, they are going to reveal information, like I said, that was suppressed, and it'll certainly bring a lot of information to light. There was an article in the Oklahoma Gazette, I believe it was in January, and Terry Nichols' face was on the cover of the issue, and that's an independent paper here in town. And below the title of the paper was called "The Perfect Storm," and the writer of that article alluded to this fact that if this trial does, come about, which it did, and the information does get out, it could wreak some really bad havoc. And so, it'll be interesting to see how this all turns out. Hopefully it'll bring out some fairness and impartiality, but that is yet to be seen.
Well, so far, the testimony, I guess in this first week, has been that they found some barrels and some fuses at Terry Nichols' house and a receipt for, I forget the certain amount of fertilizer.
2,000 pounds, yes.
2,000 pounds. Now, I just played some news clips where they say the original size of the bomb was 1,200 pounds, and then later they say it was 2,400 pounds, which, funny, is exactly double. And then we know for years and years the official story was that the truck bomb was 4,800 pounds, again exactly double. And And now it is up to the government, and Timothy McVeigh claimed before he died that the bomb was 7,000 pounds. So do they have any evidence that Terry Nichols was involved in getting 7,000 pounds of fertilizer?
No, and even if they did, it would be, at this point, erroneous because there was no ammonium nitrate actually found on the scene of the crime. And I know that sounds insane, but that is the exact allegations and the findings of the Inspector General's office. So, I mean, you could come up with all kind of figures. You can allege that this was done and that was done. But when it gets down to the scientific fact of it all, it turns out to be complete bunk.
So what do they base the idea that it was a fertilizer bomb?
Well,
that they found the receipt at his house?
Yes, it is completely erroneous, and that was the pleadings of Stephen Jones in the original trial with McVeigh, which Judge Mace suppressed. He would not allow him to enter any information that would show that what the prosecution claimed was erroneous. I mean, there was a, for lack of a better term, a party line that was held to, and Judge Mace really didn't want to vary from that particular argument.
And if I remember correctly, because of the backlash from the Inspector General's report against the FBI lab, they had to bring in a British bomb expert to come in and tell the jury that a ammonium nitrate bomb did it, right?
Yes, and Charles Key had filled me in on her testimony. He read it, according to the transcripts of the court back in, I believe it was 97, that she was very qualified on her response. She had a very, very narrow door to step through on this, and she was very careful in what she said and what she didn't say. And the only reason they brought her in, I found out, was legal ramifications, that she could not perjure herself on the stand because she was not a U.S. citizen. She was not a U.S. national. She was actually from Britain, so she wasn't subject to a lot of the, the counts of perjury and basically lying on the stand. So the federal prosecution had a lot of leeway to work with her. But what she said was very qualified and was very limited, and it really didn't amount to much at all.
That's interesting. I mean, really, we have, up until September 11th, the biggest single crime in American history, and the very basic premise for the whole case was that it was done with a fertilizer bomb, and yet we have as the source for that a completely circular argument. We know that Nichols is guilty because we have a receipt for fertilizer, and we know it was a fertilizer bomb because Nichols has a receipt for it. Is that all they have?
That's pretty much all they had. In fact, the prima dead cord, there wasn't even any evidence found of that at the crime scene, and that was a finding that the Inspector General's office had made. You and I talked about this report, and I got it directly from Frederick Whitehurst, who, interestingly enough, was the head of the FBI lab that was in charge of investigating this crime scene. Mr. Whitehurst was specifically asked not to fly to Oklahoma City. It was his boss and the underlings, the people that actually worked under him, that were brought to Oklahoma City. Whitehurst was not brought here because they knew that he would not perjure himself. He would not twist the facts. He was very objective about everything, and it would have completely dissolved the case that the federal prosecution had. So the insanity on this case just never ends.
Also, there's the story that the bomb was assembled at Geary State Lake in Kansas by Nichols and McVeigh, and now I believe that the testimony at McVeigh's trial, or was it at Nichols' trial, that people saw different vehicles around a Ryder truck at Geary State Lake, but none of those trucks were Nichols' trucks, and they never did identify what vehicles those were. And then somehow we're to believe that he drove from Geary State Lake, which I believe he told me was 200 miles from Oklahoma City, with this, according to the Justice Files or the 60 Minutes version of this story, is that in these giant barrels in the back of this dually truck was this kind of slurpy mix of fuel oil and fertilizer, and that, from everything I've been led to believe, there's no way that he could have driven it 200 miles without blowing himself up on the way if it was made the way that he claimed it was made and that they claimed it was made.
You are correct, Phil, and another twist to that whole thing is that you have to have almost perfect lab conditions to actually detonate ammonium nitrate and fuel oil to its entirety, to even have come close to doing what was claimed to have done in Oklahoma City. Those conditions didn't exist by any stretch of the imagination. That truck, if it was under perfect conditions, it had to be within the box where this material was handled. And I stood next to an identical vehicle that allegedly was used by McVeigh and was driven up about 4 months ago at a dealership in Oklahoma. I saw the exact same model truck that came off the same assembly line within about a week after this one. So, I mean, we're looking at pretty much a clone of what allegedly McVeigh had. And I stood there and I looked at this thing. The box itself was 18 feet long. And to sustain any type of perfect lab conditions, it would have been impossible. And even if it was, McVeigh would have not survived that road trip. You're correct. It would have blown himself up. And there were other accomplices in the truck, we know that. And there's videotape proof of that. There were 3 attorneys in town that had seen that videotape. So to say that he did it by himself, and it's just ludicrous. And there's no other way to say it. It simply did not happen that way. There was something else besides ammonium nitrate fuel oil in that truck.
Do you have an idea of what was in the truck?
Well, there was a case of stolen an entire pallet load of C4 stolen from a local an Army base within 300 miles of here, within 48 hours of that particular incident. So, you know, that this doesn't come up missing by accident. There was a purpose, there was a deliberate move, a deliberate transfer of something. Now, we don't know if that was what had happened, but having that in the truck would have been more consistent with the scale of the damage done to that building than anything ammonium nitrate could have done.
There's footage in a video called What Really Happened in Oklahoma City where, or in fact, maybe, I don't know, I got so many videos of Oklahoma City stuff. There's one where it's quite an extended interview with, I believe, the command firefighter inside the building, I guess after the bodies have all been removed, so it's a few days after the bombing at least, and that they show from inside the building, the cameraman asks, where's the crater? And he says, well, the crater's over here, and he points at the crater out in the street, and it's the size of a Honda, not the size of something you'd find on the moon or something like they drew pictures of in Time magazine.
Right. It's not even consistent with what the government allegedly said was in that truck. And if I may add, since we're on this line of thought, I had an interview with Carlton Armstrong. He was the lead perpetrator in the Sterling Hall bombing in Madison, Wisconsin on August 24, 1970. I flew up and visited with him last August on 2 different occasions. And Carlton looked at the material, the final report the Oklahoma City Bombing Investigation Committee wrote. He looked at videotapes that you cite in addition to others. And in our second meeting, after about an hour and a half into the conversation, he took off his glasses, he looked at me, and he says, Chris, there's absolutely no way that Mr. McVeigh and Mr. Nichols could have done what they did with what the government allegedly claimed they had. And there's no way they could have done it by themselves. It would have been physically, financially, and mentally impossible to pull off that scale, large scale of damage to that building, but with these 2. And they had no expertise. And, I mean, here's a gentleman that actually designed a smaller version of that particular ordinance. He showed me how he did it, not that I really wanted to know, but just for the matter of the fact and the point of getting across what he knew and, you know, his knowledge of the extent and the capability of that ordinance. So he had to bring the point across, and I looked at him and I says, Carlton, you know, would you be willing to come down to Oklahoma City and repeat what you said? And he says, absolutely. And it was chilling just to sit there and talk to this gentleman, knowing what he had done and knowing his knowledge of what the capabilities of that ordinance was. So.
Well, and there's other expert testimony besides that in the person, particularly I'm thinking of General Benton Parton.
Yes.
Can you explain to us, I know that you've gone over his material in detail, can you explain to us, how does he explain the damage to the building?
Yes, General Parton is, for some of your readers that may not know, worked in the Pentagon for 15 years. He was with NATO for 25 years. It was his job to design ordnance to take out hard targets 3, 4, sometimes 10 times the size of the Murrah building. So he knew exactly what happened in the building. His first observations within 24 hours, he told me, he says that there was telltale signs that there was ordnance in the building that literally blew out the superstructure on 4 main columns in that building out. So as far as having anything on the street that would do that it's ludicrous. I'm not saying that there wasn't a bomb in the truck, but it was, as you know, as my observations, I told him after reviewing blueprints of the building with him, after going through all of the photos taken, that, by the way, he wasn't even allowed in the crime scene. He was a ranking retired general in the military, 35 years, and the FBI wouldn't even let him on the crime scene. He couldn't even badge his way through. But long story short is both of us came up with the same conclusion, that building was being demolished, was being taken apart a full 5 to 8 seconds before that truck bomb even went off. So in the whole scheme of the demolition of the Murrah building, the truck bomb was simply an afterthought. And the pictures prove it, the blueprints prove it, the damage of what happened and what didn't happen, what should have happened to those support columns prove it. I mean, there's any way you look at this, all the arrows are pointing in the direction the General Parton claims that there was interior ordnance in there that went off before the truck bomb was even detonated. It's astonishing.
And that is 4 bombs on the 3rd floor level, right?
Yes, between the 2nd and 3rd floor level. And if you and I may have a chance to look at the blueprints, and I've got 2 different sets, a partial set from the GSA office in Fort Worth, and then another set from another source here in town. That interestingly enough, the insurance companies had to use to settle all the claims of health and so forth. But the detonation is consistent with where the service closets were and where the electrical areas were in the building. And it was a unique type of architecture. And I can't get into the details on that right now on the radio because I don't want to incriminate anybody else on this thing. But or incriminate is not the right word. I don't want to reveal their identity, I should say, the civilians that have helped me out on this. But you're right. I mean, there were ordnance at least on 2 floors, if not 3, in that building that went off.
Okay, now someone in the audience right now is saying, yeah, but what about the Khobar Towers? Remember Al-Qaeda's first attack that killed Marines in Saudi Arabia? And they say, but didn't the front of the building of that Khobar Towers, that was a truck bomb, and didn't that look just like Oklahoma City?
Well, it did. In fact, I'm glad they brought that up because that proves our point even more. There was a more powerful fuel bomb that was used on that building. That building wasn't even anywhere near the code of what the Murrah building was built to, and I did discuss this with the project manager and a couple of the architects of the Murrah building. So here you have a more powerful bomb at the Khobar Towers. I mean, it was proven with the dynamite and the fuel that was in that truck, blowing up against a building that was much smaller, less code, and it did less damage. So, you do the math on that, and it proves that, what had happened in the Murrah building certainly was caused by something infinitely more powerful than what the government claimed was used.
Well, and in fact, in the Khobar Towers, the face of the building was blown off, and so it looks at first glance similar to the Oklahoma City Federal Building. But in fact, if you look at it closely, not a single column has collapsed in the Khobar Towers. Where how many columns collapsed in Oklahoma City? 7.
There were at least there were 4 main columns, and then 3 others collapsed under what they call progressive collapse, the inferior design of the building. But that certainly didn't have that was just a minor part of that. So there were, I believe, 7 altogether that collapsed.
Okay, now we played news clips before I brought you on here, where the news talked pretty much all morning and afternoon about multiple bombs inside the building that did go off, and that they had found at least 2, perhaps 3, that were set to go off but did not go off and were removed from inside the building. And we also heard a clip, which, by the way, I got to say right here, I've interviewed VZ Lawton on this show.
VZ's great. Yeah, he's a very good source of information.
And also his friend Jack, I forget his last name, they both had a similar experience. Jack had hid under the desk because he was from California and thought it was an earthquake. Yes. VZ had been conked on the head by something falling off the wall and had fallen behind the desk. And both of them were alike in that they were saved the flying glass wounds that many other people had suffered, and that seemed to indicate, as you said before, that the truck bomb was an afterthought, that the building was actually being destroyed from the inside first. I think you said over a period of 8 seconds, and then that the truck bomb went off last. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes, that's correct. And Dr. Jack Govan is the one you're referring to. I had a chance to interview him. He's a very good source of information. You're correct.
And also we have the seismograph information, and Dr. Ray Brown would seem to indicate the same thing. Is that right?
Yes. Like I said, all the arrows are pointing in one direction, and it's certainly not the direction that the federal government is walking on this case.
True. And, I was quite suspicious, to be honest. Who could have access to the inside of a federal building? And I asked VZ Lawton, who worked there and was there the day of the bombing, and he said anybody. Oh, man, the security there was so lax that, I know some people have assumed that it must have been someone in the government who placed the bombs in there because, after all, it was the inside of a federal building. But VZ Lawton said anybody could have walked in there and put bombs in there.
General Parton had told me specifically, and he did tests on ordnance and structures out in White Sands, naval or the military reserve in New Mexico, and various installations around the country. They would set up buildings like the Murrah building, and just blow them up just to see how the ordnance worked. And he told me, he says, Chris, what you have to do is you just go in, and I'm not going to go into the details, but you said you could set your ordnance anywhere you want in those buildings if there's no security, set the timer and walk away. It was as simple as that. Not that I'm condoning that. I certainly don't condone any of that action, but he had to relay that to me to tell me how simple it was to get in that building. There was no security on that building. And that's a whole other conversation that we can get into, and how the federal government should be held liable for that. That the security cameras that were supposed to be in that building were actually sitting in a warehouse outside of Washington, D.C., running out on their warranties. That equipment was never installed in the building. In fact, it was overdue a year. It should have been in there. It never was installed. So, once again, that's a whole other parallel situation we can get into later.
Okay, we also heard a clip from Edie Smith, who made quite a stink because some doofus reporter accidentally handed her a microphone live on CNN around the world where she said, hey, I'm trying to find out how come ATF wasn't in the building, and they just keep telling me to shut up. So now I just want to know even more.
That's right. And the ATF and some of the leaders with the FBI incriminated themselves. And in fact, I'm lying. They interviewed Edie's dad, and he had talked to him. His name was Glenn Wilburn. And, Glenn is asking one question at 10 o'clock in the morning, and at 2 p.m. on national TV, the head of the ATF is claiming that they did have prior knowledge. So, you're having your field agent say one thing, and the head of the national office say something completely different. I could see why Edie would get upset. I would do the same thing, especially if I had children killed in the bombing like she did. She had every right to say that.
Well, how would ATF had known that there was something going to happen that day that they shouldn't be there for?
Well, there were memos that were distributed through the U.S. Marshal's office, and you and I had discussed this in, I believe, in a previous show, and Charles may have brought it up. But as early as, I believe, the second or third week of February of 1995, there was pretty much an APB put out, an alert to all of the Marshal's office. And, of course, that would permeate to all of the federal installations, Long Island, Los Angeles, Chicago, Atlanta, Miami, Oklahoma City, Fort Worth. Their installation had an alert on it. So it certainly wasn't any big surprise to these people. Why they chose to lie about it on TV is beyond me, but it was a very poor effort in trying to cover their tracks because they just made things worse.
Well, do we know what the source of the memo from the Marshal's office was?
I don't know specifically, but there are sources, in foreign intelligence and the U.S. embassies in various countries, the RCMP out of Canada, Scotland Yard. When you have the high-level intelligence services working with each other, they're covering each other's back. And once they give that information to their parallel agency in another country, it's up to that agency to disseminate it accordingly. And it appears what happened in the United States, it wasn't disseminated quickly and effectively enough. And unfortunately, we were caught flat-footed here, literally.
Well, and didn't they also have an undercover informant who had been warning them that something was about to happen?
Oh, yeah, Carol Howe. And she was put on trial and exonerated of all charges, and she did her best to get the information out. And Ms. Howe was, excoriated and treated like a pariah, which she wasn't. She was a very credible source of information.
Well, for our listeners who have no idea who Carol Howe is or any of that story, why don't you tell us a little bit about her and why it was that anybody should have been listening to her?
Carol Howe was an informant for the FBI and what we now know as Elohim City. And there was a compound there that, come to find out, there were undercover agents from the FBI and other agencies that didn't even know about each other in this compound. And they
she worked for ATF, right?
Yes.
Oh,
yeah.
I'm sorry. I was just making sure, because you said FBI, I thought,
there was a contact with the FBI that she worked with later on after the truth had come out on this.
Oh, I see.
And I'm not quite sure how this all wound out together in her trial, but ATF and FBI and some of her main contacts were brought on the stand to testify. What had happened was that she tried to get this information out for, I believe, at least 35 to 45 days before the bombing, and nobody listened to her. And there was a breakdown in communication. There was turf wars between the field offices here, and you and I discussed this on a previous interview, as well as the national offices of the FBI and the ATF. They did not know of each other's efforts, and they didn't even know that their informants were in this compound. So when you have that fragmented, compartmentalized type of communication going on, something horrific is bound to happen, and unfortunately we saw that. Ms. Howe, after the fact, even said, look, I gave you this information. Well, what's that going to say to the government? I mean, there's another complicity. If they can't communicate, if they don't have, again, bring back the security equipment that they should have had in the building, this thing compounds itself on itself, and it's unbelievable. It's just layer upon layer upon layer of lying and confusion and ineptitude. And so, long story short, Ms. Howe was put on trial for allegedly lying under oath and so forth in these interviews and post-bombing interviews, and the judge says no way. She told the truth, and she was exonerated of all charges. I shouldn't say the judge. The jury found out that she was acquitted, and so she walked away from this thing pretty much on the same level of truthfulness that she started with. And why that story never came out, I don't know, but it should be brought out.
Well, according to the papers, I guess the leaks off the record from the defense attorneys in the current Nichols trial, they're going to rely on Carol Howe, or at least part of her story. They seem to be saying that the defense that they're preparing is that Nichols was the fall guy for the Aryan Republican Army.
That may very well be, and I hope they bring out some other elements, too, that, as Jana Davis has developed and proven many times over, that it was a convoluted mix of possibly this white, Aryan nation's brotherhood. I don't know, but I know of more of substantial connections to the Middle East. So they were working hand in hand, possibly with each other. And Nichols, it appears, was a fall guy. He was as a lackey or a useful idiot in this whole thing. And so there has to be more of the truth brought out, and more people should be held accountable for what happened. There's no question about it.
Well, let's focus on this Middle Eastern connection here, because it's funny, in the studying that I've done, it seems like if, there's kind of the two different stories, and where they come together isn't exactly clear, but like you were saying, on the one hand, the white supremacist angle, and on the other hand, the foreign, perhaps Arab terrorist angle. And I always thought that the foreign terrorist angle was really all centered on the idea that Nichols had contact with all these guys when he was in the Philippines, and testimony that he had been in bomb-making school with Ramzi Youssef and so forth.
Correct. I had been keeping in touch with Terry's brother, James, and he told me that simply wasn't true, that Terry hadn't gone over to the Philippines to the extent a lot of people had, and had corrected the record for some investigators that are still looking at this case. Honestly, I don't know the capacity to serve with these guys. That will certainly, hopefully, come out at trial. The defense attorneys claim that he had no connection at all with him, so I don't know, what type of, how substantial that claim is. But what I looked at,
I wouldn't take what James Nichols says too seriously. I mean, I thought Stephen Jones had people who were ready to come here and testify that Terry Nichols was a guy named the Farmer, and that they were in bomb-making school with him, but Judge Mage wouldn't let Stephen Jones bring them here to testify to that.
Exactly. And here again, like I said, I'm just trying to fit a piece of the puzzle. This is an intricate puzzle. So you take what he says with, to a certain degree of credibility, and you kind of leave it at that. But what I did, try to piece all of this, the Aryan nations and whatever groups they claim to be involved with the Middle East, is that you look back 30 and 40 years and what had happened in Europe. You have the white supremacists in Germany that were still very powerful after World War II, even though the Nazi Party was, for all intents and purposes, gone. But there are the Middle Eastern connections with terrorism in there. I mean, Italy was just, they'd gone through a war currently going through, 30, 40, 50 years ago. So, it's not that there isn't connections with these people. We just have to figure out who's doing what, who the paymasters are, who's running the money. It's just a lot of different trails that you have to pursue. And I think there is some credibility to having both of those particular groups work with each other to cover each other's back and to create aliases, false flag operations, confuse the heck out of the law enforcement community. So,
what do you think about the... I'm trying to remember, in fact, when this came out. I believe it was post-September 11th, but before McVeigh was executed, or... No, September 11th happened after McVeigh. I guess it was right before McVeigh was executed. There was a leak from the Department of Defense that said that McVeigh had phone numbers of Iraqis in his pocket.
That could very well be. I would not be surprised.
See, that's the thing. That kind of thing, to me, sounds like it was coming out of the Office of Special Plans, and that sounds like a Paul Wolfowitz thing. Because, you got this lady, Lori Milroy, who, all her conspiracy theories are endorsed by Dick Cheney and Paul Wolfowitz and the neocon crew. And they're basically trying to say, in fact, Paul Wolfowitz, I think in his Vanity Fair interview, said that he thought the Iraqis were behind the Oklahoma City bombing. And I think that from everything that I've been able to find out, I think any ties between Ramzi Youssef and Hussein al-Hussein, or Hussein al-Husseini, whatever the guy's name was, that any links between them and the Iraqi government near the time of the Oklahoma bombing, I mean, that to me sounds like a bunch of neocon propaganda getting confused into the real story, which that perhaps these people were involved in the bombing, but not that it leads back to Saddam Hussein.
No, there are other parties involved, and that's still something that has to be brought out. I don't have the expertise to pursue that, but I know Jana Davis would be able to steer you in the right direction on that, so she would be one to develop that avenue. But you're right, the neocon, I wouldn't trust their word. I mean, after all, what credibility do they have, or the group that you just mentioned?
Sure, and yeah, at this point, I don't know. Apparently they still have some. Tell people about Jana Davis. Who's she?
Jana Davis worked for KFOR, Channel 4 here in Oklahoma City, and she was graduated from, I believe, journalism and television journalism in the University of Texas in Austin. She came up here and was a very good beat reporter. She did a lot of remotes. Of course, when the bombing happened, she was down on the scene immediately, and she smelled a skunk within 2-3 days. And very bright, very good individual. The locals, law enforcement, both the City of Oklahoma City Police Department and the county sheriffs were coming to her and saying, Jana, this just isn't adding up. Could you pursue some other avenues that we have some credible information on? She did. Well, it just so happened that the KFOR, in fact, they got one of the business cards with, ironically, her replacement, who was hired this last May. After all this time, they finally filled a position. It has the New York Times logo on there. They were bought up by the New York Times shortly after the bombing. All of her expense accounts, her cell phone, her helicopter, everything was taken away from her because she was actually going down the right path on this, bringing in Middle Eastern connections. Long story short, she was fired. They said, we don't need your services anymore, you're on your own. And she kept pursuing this very doggedly. Had a few bumps in the road, some misinformation, but overall, Ms. Davis has done an excellent job. Has a brand new book out. I don't have the title of it, but I know it is on Amazon.com. If you go under Jana Davis, under author search, it's there. And it was released, I believe, about 3 weeks ago. It pursues all of the very credible connections to the Middle East, what happened here in Oklahoma City, and some individuals that are still living here. It's astonishing, but it's true. And people have to look at that to really get a better idea of what's going on.
Wow. Bought out by the New York Times and fired, huh?
Yep.
But I thought they were all the news that was fit to print.
Well, obviously not. And this new contact that I've established that filled her position and told me that she was asked to walk a very tight rope on the case. Information was given to her, and she couldn't do anything about it. Her managing senior program director said, don't even touch this. So here we go. I mean, it's one vicious circle. It's going to happen all over again. If we want to get this information out, it's going to be suppressed. There's no doubt about it. So.
Oh, man.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling when you think about it, Phil. It's very, very sobering to look at this whole thing.
And, let's stick with that for a second. I'm kind of in the unfortunate position that I never believed their BS from the very beginning. I just, by coincidence, happened to be near someone who had served some tours in Special Forces in Vietnam and knew some things about blowing things up. And the day it happened, he told me, don't believe him for a minute. No truck bomb did that. And I saw General Parton and found out, all about Hoppy Heidelberg and how, all this was going really from the get-go. And so I'm trying to put myself in the place of someone who doesn't know any of this story and thinks that, they have basically two choices on listening to this interview. One, either you're crazy and I'm a liar, or vice versa, or both. Or they have to completely re-examine the way they look at American media, the way they look at the two political parties, the way they look at the relationship between the Republican Congress and the Democratic presidency in the 1990s. They are going to have to reevaluate their entire conception of what's going on around here. And, in fact, this is probably why this case is such a big deal to me, because I don't think that anybody who understands even a portion of what was really going on in the Oklahoma City bombing, I don't know how they can ever get over the fact that the Republicans never held a single hearing for the biggest crime in American history.
There was an interview that I had a few days after I spoke with you last month, and the gentleman asked me, he says, what really happened here? And I said, look, you've got to put Nichols, McVeigh, the truck bomb, anything that you've been told by CNN, Fox, and all the major media, put it in a box, throw it out the window, and start all over again. You have to completely shatter your paradigm of understanding of this case, and you have to start all over. Once you do that, you'll begin to understand that, and like you said, there is no difference between the Republican and the Democratic Party. And I'm not a political hack here. I don't have any preference on politics. But the analogy with those two parties, to tie it all into this conversation, is that it's like putting cream in your coffee. Where does the cream end and where does the coffee begin? There is no difference between those parties. They're covering each other's back, and it's been like that for some time. So this whole paradigm has to be shattered. You have to look at it in a different way. Once you do so, then you really understand what happened here. And it's very, very unfortunate because these people here in Oklahoma City, and I'm coming in 3 years, into the case, and I've only been here a year. They've been lied to, they've been ignored, they've been played as fools, and that's not the way the United States of America should be run. These people are better than that. They deserve better than that. So that's my take on the whole thing.
Well, I sure appreciate the part you're playing. I want to, at the end here, recommend some sources for people who would like to read about this. In fact, to me, that is the major purpose of radio, is to recommend books. For that is where true understanding in depth is going to come from. There's a book by Stephen Jones, McVeigh's original lawyer, called Others Unknown. And, of course, everyone take these for what they are and accept what you like and check your footnotes carefully and use your discernment. There's, of course, the final report of the Oklahoma City Bombing Investigation Committee, of which my guest is a part. There's a book called Day One of the Oklahoma City Bombing. There's a book called Freedom's End, which is by Terry Nichols' brother James, which there's a lot of interesting things in there, but that guy's a kook and his brother's a terrorist, and so I don't really like that book all that much. But there's some interesting things in there, to say the least. There's a book by a British reporter named Ambrose Evans Pritchard called The Secret Life of Bill Clinton, and one of the sections in there goes into a great deal of detail about the white supremacist connection and the Carroll House story and all that.
That book actually piqued my interest in this case, and that's what got me started. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's really shocking to think that, the Daily Telegraph, which is one of the most respected newspapers, it's not some tabloid, it's one of the most respected newspapers in the UK, and that they wrote all about the truth of the Oklahoma bombing for years, while it was a complete shutout over here.
Yeah. Now, I understand, if I'm not mistaken, Rupert Murdoch now owns the paper, but back then I don't think he had majority interest in it, so they were a little more objective. What they failed to do is pursue the damage done to the building and how it did correlate to the truck bomb. But at the time, what they had to work with was fairly respectable, and I have to give Mr. Pritchard a lot of credit for kicking open some doors that nobody wanted open in the first place, and he needs to be applauded for that.
Yeah, and it definitely kind of takes, people like Charles Key, former state representative, or current at the time that he started raising Cain about this, and and people like Frederick Whitehurst, who you mentioned before. There's a book, I don't know if it's by him or about him, called Tainted Evidence.
Okay.
I
haven't read it.
I haven't either, but I've heard quite a bit about it. Apparently, it really goes into detail about that Inspector General's report and Frederick Whitehurst exposing all the corruption in the FBI laboratory. And, of course, on the Internet, the New American Magazine, which they're pretty right-wing, but they have an excellent archive of articles about the Oklahoma City bombing, again, going all the way back to the very beginning, and also WorldNet Daily does. Do you have any good sources to add to that?
Well, the Inspector General's report, you and I had talked about this, I think, earlier today. Frederick Whitehurst sent me a copy on the DVD, or on a CD-ROM, and that particular report completely shatters anything the federal government claimed or entered into court in Denver. There were 7 files that he sent me. One of them was 690 pages long, and there were 18 cases on that 690-page file that show that the FBI, just blatantly lied about what they did on similar cases. Not quite as major as the Oklahoma City bombing. 33 pages are specifically deal with the Oklahoma City bombing, and you see the conclusions reached by the Inspector General's office. And my God, it's amazing what the federal government tried to get away with on this case, and what they actually got away with. And it has to be brought back. It has to be reinvestigated, and people who need to be held accountable. So, anyway, that's all I had.
Well, I sure appreciate your effort on this case, sir, and I wish you the best of luck. I hope that, I guess 2 days before the anniversary on April the 19th next month, I hope to put together quite a big interview of as many of the people with the inside story as possible. Oh, which reminds me, and I don't know if we talked about this on the last interview or not, but right after the execution of McVeigh, there was the Dan Rather interview of former FBI agents who came out and said, hey, they still haven't turned over to the defense our documents that we wrote up, and that you have connections with one of these guys now, Rick Ojeda, is that correct?
Rick knows VZ and Charles and the committee real well. He lives in Georgetown and is, I believe, a successful lawyer down there. And yes, Rick has done a very admirable job, and he's one of the few brave FBI agents, former agents, that chose to tell the truth about this, at least what they knew about it. So
hopefully we can arrange that for April the 17th.
Yes.
Great. All right. Well, I want to thank you again for coming on the show and helping explain to people that it is possible for the government to lie about the biggest crime ever.
Yeah, it is, and please don't doubt the efforts of what we're doing up here, because they're infinitely more credible than anything the FBI had chosen to offer on this case, and we just want the truth to come out. So thanks, Phil. I appreciate you having me on.
Well, I sure appreciate you coming on.
Thank you.
Everyone, Chris Emery from the Oklahoma City Bombing Investigation Committee.